Hello and welcome. You are watching Around the World here on News 9. I'm Krishna Kumar. Here's a roundup of the top international stories that we're tracking here. We begin with the protests against Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, which has now resulted in the delaying of the decision on the bitterly contested plans for the judicial overhaul in Israel. The plans remain stayed until next month, and that came amidst fears that Israel's worst national crisis in years could fracture Netanyahu's ruling coalition or even escalate into violence. Take a look at this report.
As protests intensified across Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Monday announced he would delay a decision on a bitterly contested plan to overhaul the judiciary and would seek time for compromise. The move comes as fears rise that Israel's worst national crisis in years could fracture his coalition or escalate into violence. In a televised address, Netanyahu said, "Where there's an opportunity to avoid civil war through dialogue, I, as prime minister, am taking a time out for dialogue." Opposition parties said they would work to reach an agreement if the government was sincere. Former centrist Prime Minister Yair Lapid said the opposition needed to be sure Netanyahu was not bluffing, but also pointed out in a statement, "If the government engages in a real and fair dialogue, we can come out of this moment of crisis stronger and more united, and we can turn this into a defining moment in our ability to live together." Justice Minister Yariv Levin, who's been leading the judicial reform process, said that as a member of Netanyahu's Likud party, he would respect whatever decision the prime minister reached. A situation in which everyone does as they wish is liable to bring about the instant fall of the government and collapse of Likud, he said in a statement. Protesters have flooded Israeli streets for weeks to express their opposition to the plan, which would limit the Supreme Court's powers to rule against the legislature and the executive, while giving coalition lawmakers more power in appointing judges. Netanyahu, himself on trial on corruption charges which he denies, has promised to ensure civil rights are protected, but has not backed down from the central thrust of the reforms. His decision Sunday to fire the defense chief for opposing his plans prompted mass overnight protests. Some members of parliament chanted "shame, shame" as the government coalition pressed ahead with the plan earlier Monday, while opposition from a labor union grounded flights at Ben Gurion Airport. The union said it had called off the strikes after Netanyahu announced the delay, which was praised by leaders in the UK and US governments. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
We welcome this announcement as an opportunity to create additional time and space for compromise. Compromise is precisely what we have been calling for, and we continue to strongly urge Israeli leaders to find a compromise as soon as possible.
The crisis is among the worst in Israeli domestic political history and comes amid escalating violence in the West Bank, where more than 250 Palestinian gunmen and civilians and more than 40 Israelis have been killed in the past year.
Shifting focus away from Israel to France, where the protests against President Emmanuel Macron's controversial pension reforms is likely to affect those approaching the retirement age, and they're also being joined in by teenagers and young people in those protests. Olivia Zollino takes a look at why in this report.
Huge crowds have gathered in France in recent weeks to protest a controversial rise in the country's pension age by 2 years to 64. Some of the marches have turned violent. While the reform is most relevant to those approaching retirement, many young people are also taking to the streets. But why might that be? The French youth have joined the protests in growing numbers since the government bypassed parliament to push the plans through. Every night for the past few weeks, 18-year-old Charles Choliac has been making his voice heard. Not just for his parents, but for himself.
I am against this reform simply because I have two parents who are killing themselves at work and damaging their health, and I don't want to see them die at work. My father, he works every day. He gets up to get on the tarmac at Charles de Gaulle Airport at 5 a.m. to load the planes. I find it difficult to imagine myself at 64 getting up at 3 a.m.
Sholiak is part of groups started by university students to organize unauthorized demonstrations, which are usually carried out in the evenings. While a few protesters have been seen torching bins and throwing rocks at police, Sholiak insists he hasn't. Opinion polls show a wide majority of voters are opposed to the pension bill. They are further angered by Macron's leadership style and the government's decision to skip the parliamentary vote.
For young people like me, we grew up with the hope of being able to influence our society. And when we see that decisions are made without consulting the people who make up this society, that takes away the possibility of being able to change things.
Many students like Sholiak have been joining private groups on social media, which helps students mobilize for spontaneous protests. He says they help prevent the groups being noticed by police. But does Sholiak worry about the repercussions should the demonstrations get out of hand?
I wonder about that because I know what can happen to us too. We see the images and we see what happens to fellow protesters, but that wouldn't prevent me from demonstrating because I'm so outraged that it surpasses potentially endangering myself.
Macron recently said he would press ahead with the reforms. Unions have called for regional action and the continuation of nationwide strikes and protests.
Now, as France frets about an extended drought and prospects for more wildfires, one blaze that erupted around 8 months ago in the southwest of France still smolders away underground. Take a look at this report.
This is what remains of a forest outside the town of Roundup in southwestern France. A wildfire erupted here in July 2022. 8 months later, the land still smolders away underground, caused by the brown coal in the area's peaty soil.
We have to make sure that fires can't start again from these hotspots.
The blaze at Roundup is a remnant of huge wildfires that ravaged southern Europe in summer 2022. Worst drought on record was compounded by successive heat waves, which scientists say are consistent with climate change. The Gironde region in southwest of France was particularly badly hit, with more than 49,000 acres of forest destroyed. And the risk of renewed fires is a great concern. Guillaume Carnier works for France's National Forest Agency.
So the risks, now that everything is exploited around it, are minimised because there is less flammable material all around, on the massif, as there are large areas that have been cut down. But there are still some green patches, and there is all the vegetation that will come back in the spring, which will be flammable.
The fire in Roundup is under constant surveillance from drones measuring heat levels. That's according to Pascal Gau, a local official in charge of environmental protection.
We are now coming to a period where spring fires can break out, so obviously we need an urgent response from the government on aerial assets, and we can no longer sail by sight.
An unusually dry winter across parts of southern Europe has reduced moisture in the soil. It raises fears of a repeat of 2022, when almost 2 million acres of land were destroyed. That's according to European Commission statistics. Governments are therefore working out how to make forests and woodlands more resilient to climate change. Over in Gironde, the wildfires that surrounded the town of Aurigne and displaced its inhabitants last July are long extinguished. But Mayor Vincent Didieu could not hide his sadness while looking at the wide, empty land.
Today we have lost all our landmarks because today, you see, it's completely lunar. We're in this somewhat deserted landscape. I said it before, we'll have the shock of burnt trees, but we'll also have the shock when the trees are gone.
Away from all of that to the war between Russia and Ukraine in Ukraine. Now, Russia's mercenary group, the Wagner Group, has now put up a 17-story high advertisement to recruit mercenaries in Moscow, Russia's capital. Now, this is the force that has led Russia's offensive in the frontline town of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. And now we hear that the mercenary group is replenishing its resources ahead of an expected Ukrainian counteroffensive. This report tells you more.
A giant recruitment ad for Russia's Wagner mercenary force has appeared on the facade of an office block in northeast Moscow. Wagner is thought to have sustained heavy losses in the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut, the longest, bloodiest battle of the war so far. It fights alongside Russian forces in the region and has sought to replenish troop numbers ahead of a potential Ukrainian counteroffensive. 17 stories high, the ad shows the group's logo and the slogans, "Join the winning team" and "Together we will win." Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin said earlier this month that he aimed to recruit 30,000 new fighters by mid-May. Ukrainian and Western officials say Wagner is sending poorly prepared fighters to certain death. For months, Wagner has spearheaded Russia's push to take the small city of Bakhmut, which is now in ruins. Both sides have referred to Bakhmut as a meat grinder. Prigozhin has said his men's task there is to bleed the Ukrainian army dry.
Now, since the Taliban banned Afghan girls and women from higher education, a growing number of them are turning to online study at home. And even there, they must grapple with the stuttering internet and power cuts, if they can afford a computer at all in the first place. Take a look at this.
In her Kabul home, Sophia logs on to an online English class.
You get awareness.
The Taliban government has barred female students from high schools and universities, but it hasn't banned the internet. In fact, Taliban officials are regulars on social media. But Sophia's classmates distort and the picture freezes. Power cuts and cripplingly slow internet provide yet more hurdles for Afghan women. The 22-year-old says after years of war and the Taliban, they're used to persevering.
Impactful. I want to continue my studies in online courses, and this is my dream, this is my goal, to finish my studying, whatever what happened in Afghanistan.
Miss Sophia, how are you?
Her online school, Rumi Academy, went from about 50 mostly female students to more than 500 after the Taliban took over in 2021. It says it had to turn hundreds down. The Taliban still allow online study, but Sophia's teacher Sana says there are always security concerns.
It's so obvious that if you want to do a crucial thing, if you want to take an action that is very important, you have to risk. And absolutely, we risked everything. Yes, it is risky for us.
A growing number of institutes are trying to reach girls and women digitally in their homes. 97% of Afghans are poor, so computers and Wi-Fi are out of reach for many. But Sophia believes it's impossible for Afghan women to be kept at home indefinitely.
After every sunset, there is sunshine, there is a day. So this is why we must be hopeful and we don't lose our belief, our hopes, and we must be strong in that situation.
Away from all of that, Alibaba's founder, Jack Ma, has returned to China. And that's according to the South China Morning Post, which has reported about it. And that is ending a more than year-long sojourn overseas that was viewed by the industry as reflecting of the sober mood of China's private businesses.
Alibaba founder Jack Ma has returned to China after spending more than a year overseas. He resurfaced at a school he founded in Hangzhou, also home to his e-commerce titan. Ma's travels abroad, which included Japan and Australia, were viewed as a reflection of the sober mood of China's private businesses. One of the country's most outspoken businessmen, he retreated from the limelight after criticising China's financial regulators in 2020. Some regarded his comments as the catalyst, which triggered a wide-ranging regulatory crackdown by Beijing on tech entrepreneurs. Chinese authorities said in recent months they had ended this crackdown and would instead support the sector. But Chinese entrepreneurs said they saw Ma's decision to stay overseas as a factor hindering confidence. Hong Kong traded shares in Alibaba rose more than 4% after the South China Morning Post reported his return.
And with that, it's a wrap here on this edition of Around the World. Thank you so much for watching. This is Krishna Kumar signing off. Keep it with News 9.